Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here in this final stretch of, I think, what's been a really fulfilling but long day. So we sit in between you and the cocktail hour. But I think you'll find this will be a very interesting session on the topic of prevention. My name is Lynette Owens. I'm the Vice President of Trend Micro's Global Consumer Education and Marketing Group, and flying all the way from a little town in the United States called Boston, Massachusetts. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I lost my voice a little bit, so please forgive me. And I'll do my best as we get through today. So I first want to give you a little bit of a background on our session. We are actually breaking up this workshop into three parts, actually. The first is a discussion about education as a preventative measure. And then the second is around technology as a preventative measure. And we will close with a brief presentation from Simon Newman, who I think has a very interesting point of view on other ways that we can mobilize to support prevention. I'll give you a little bit of a background on, if you're not familiar, Trend Micro is one of the oldest, largest cybersecurity companies in the world. There are 7,000 of us in 70 countries. We're founded 35 plus years ago, I think 36 years this fall. And we know a little bit about cyber threats, as you can see from the statistics shown here. But we have never believed that technology alone is the answer. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but this February we conducted a global study among 6,000 consumers in the US, UK, Singapore, Australia, Taiwan, and I can't recall the other, but 6,000 consumers. And we asked a question that I think might be relevant to our first topic today about education. That question was, how many of you have actually had conversations with your family members about what to do if you ever became a victim of an investment scam? So only 21% said they've ever had that kind of conversation. What if it was a romance scam? Only 13% said that. And what if it was sextortion? And the number dropped even more. And that's why I think it's a good backdrop to this topic of education. We need to talk. The session prior to this one, if any of you were in it, was about those who've been victims. And one of the biggest issues is not knowing where to go or having a support system even to rely on. So we think it starts with education. We think it starts with those conversations. And this isn't about a one-to-one discussion. It's about people talking about it among each other. It's saying it's okay to talk about it. Don't be afraid. Don't be embarrassed if it happens to you. We have to normalize that. So at Trend, we've actually been doing quite a few education initiatives. There are organizations like ChildNet. Will Gardner is here, the CEO of ChildNet. Will, if you could raise your hand. We've been a big supporter of theirs and the work they do with youth. In the United States, working with the National Council on Aging, anybody who's willing to work with us. We are developing content. We know the latest about the risks. If you want that from us, come see us. We will not charge you. This is something we feel is really important. And on the technology side, for consumers in particular, even though Trend serves large organizations, the largest in the world, down to consumers, come see us in our booth, because 2 years ago we developed this app that basically can help you take a screenshot of anything you see and verify if it's trustworthy or not. Today we announced the voice-enabled version, so I literally can show you on my phone, Siri, is this a scam? And it will do the analysis for you. With that, I want to actually now move to introducing our first panel on education. So if you would please join me up on the stage. We have Jade Richmond, who is the General Manager of the National Anti-Scam Center in Australia. Gill Thomas, who is part of this Global Cyber Alliance. Many of you may recognize Kitboga if you watch YouTube at all, from Seraph Secure, and Professor Mark Button from the University of Portsmouth. So thank you so much. Give them a round of applause. So I'd like to ask each of you to just briefly tell us, very, very briefly, I'm a pretty strict timekeeper, so very briefly, what your work is, what do you do there?
Okay, I'll keep it brief. Jade Richmond, General Manager, as we heard, of the National Anti-Scam Centre, essentially responsible for the operational teams that implement our work, and a couple of our teams are focused primarily on the education, outreach and communication side of things, as well as other things you probably heard me talk about today in my other teams. Thank you.
Hi, Gill Thomas. I'm the Director of Engagement in our Capacity and Resilience Programme here at Global Cyber Alliance. We're a non-profit. We were founded in 2015 by the District Attorney of New York, the Centre for Internet Security and the City of London Police, really focused on prevention activities. So what we've done is we now take all of our learnings and experience from what we've done in cyber over the last 7 years or so, and we're actually applying those within the fraud and scam space as we're seeing those two boundaries really moving closer and closer together. So it's all about prevention at Global Cyber Alliance.
Thanks. I'm Kitboga, or you can call me Kit. I am best known for YouTube, where I wear these glasses. I have done a lot of education in the online space, and more recently founded a scam intelligence and prevention company called Seraph Secure. And yeah, super excited to be on the panel today.
Hello everyone, I'm Professor Mark Button from the University of Portsmouth. I'm co-director of the Centre for Cybercrime and Economic Crime, which is a specialist research centre looking at fraud. I've done lots of research on different aspects of fraud over the years, and we also run various courses from degree to master's degree in economic crime.
Great, fantastic. I'm going to start with a question here that I would like all of you to answer. I think one of the discussions we've had separately and also in other circles is, it seems like there's a lot being done around education. Public awareness campaigns, content being created. Is it actually working? What's working? So I'd love from your perspective to share with this group, what does work when it comes to education on the issue of scams?
So look, I think probably annoyingly I'm going to say a big it depends. So, and I say that because I think what does work is when education and campaigns are really simple, relatable, targeted and timely, and that will really vary depending on the topic and the audience. One of the things we found at the National Anti-Scam Centre is you need to use research. You need to research your audience, you need to understand and meet them where they're at. We have a number of really bespoke pieces of work that we've done with certain communities to lift their awareness about scams. And in Australia, we have an Indigenous community that are often located in remote locations, very hard to reach audiences. And by partnering and working with Indigenous organisations, we've been able to do more bespoke outreach work with those communities in order to lift awareness. And I think the reason I raise that is because it's very easy to talk a lot about widespread big campaigns. You've heard we've been running one, Stop, Check, Protect. But sometimes those big campaigns aren't going to reach the very people that need to be reached and are particularly vulnerable or at risk of scams. The other thing I'd quickly mention is making sure that you have an evidence-based approach. So again, using research, measuring, evaluating, and learning from that next time. Also, we have a reporting portal, ScamWatch. We utilise the information provided from the public about scams to help inform it. We did some really good work on Chinese authority scams, which identified young women between 18 and 25 being really targeted in universities. And we're able to do some education in conjunction with universities and others to do that. So I guess what I am saying is that it does need to be tailored and targeted, but there is a role for broad, simple messaging as well through bigger campaigns. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yep, and I totally agree with that. Talking their language, understanding what makes sense in their specific context, because that's what the scammers do. So we need to do it, and we need to be better at it, and we need to do it consistently and constantly as well. So we at Global Cyber Alliance, we launched last year a particular scam prevention tool for 18 to 25-year-olds known as Cyberflex. And that really, we worked with that age group to understand how they digested that information, what made sense to them, how can they relate to the information that we put out. And so it's really working with that particular audience and understanding what makes sense to them so that you can keep it simple, straightforward, and in a way that they understand.
Yeah. For me, I may have a bit different perspective as a YouTuber, but I know early on I realized that if I put out a video that said the top 10 scams to look out for this year, that very few people would watch it. Or if I said here's the tips on how an influencer scam works or investment scam works, no one is sharing it. No one. But if I were to change my voice and pretend to be the old guy who falls for the scam and I make some humorous content, suddenly everyone shares it and starts talking about it. And I know that perhaps not everyone is going to change their voice and talk to scammers, but I would say what seems to work in some ways is the humor or finding a more lighthearted way to just start talking about it. Like I think in the very beginning you mentioned like no one is talking about it, and I think it can be really awkward to just say, well, it's time to talk about sextortion scams, as opposed to finding different avenues to relate to people.
We look forward to that, Kit.
First thing I'd say is, if we look at sort of medicine, we have a kind of tradition of high quality randomized controlled trials to see what works. When we come to kind of fraud prevention, and particularly scam messaging, there's very little research that kind of meets that standard. And I printed it all out here. That's the sum of it. So what does this research tell us? One of the kind of best studies was done by ARP, which is an American organization looking after older adults. And they did a number of different kinds of trials trying to deal with telemarketing fraud. And one of the key things they found that worked was where they had education being delivered to the older adults by their peers, volunteers who phoned them up, and gave them advice. They also found that reverse boiler rooms worked, where people pretend to be scammers and phone them up and then educate them. If we look at sort of phishing, again, there's a lot of research that shows if you do fake phishing and then work with the people that actually click on those kind of fake phishing links, that also works. So that's some of the kind of small amount of evidence that comes out of the research, but it obviously does also raise kind of ethical issues, particularly where we think about those studies on older adults. And I've discussed this with many people in the UK who get very nervous about doing initiatives where you pretend to be scammers and then try and educate people. So there is some evidence that certain things work, but we obviously need to do more research to find out what actually does work.
Fantastic. So if I were to summarize, if we could create messaging that was very tailored to the audience you're trying to target, use some humor to lighten the gravity of the topic, and I think this might be some effective ways of doing this. I don't think I need to then ask what doesn't work. It sounds like anything the opposite of that, unless there's anything. Okay.
Yeah, there's recently a study published on a Danish bank, and they did some messaging, and it was very general messaging, and they did analysis 6 months before and 6 months after, and they found that this general messaging had no impact whatsoever. So I think, perhaps what we can take from that is you need to be much more specific in your message, and if you do general messages like, be careful of scams, it just goes into the fog of what everyone kind of gets every day on their phones and TV and radio, etc.
Fantastic. And I didn't want to, I overlooked, Professor, the idea of peer-based delivery of the messages. That's absolutely wonderful. Fine. So let's say in a perfect world, we've created our bespoke messaging that embodies humor and is being delivered by our peers. Who is responsible for making sure that this education is being delivered to all who need it? I'm going to start with you, Jill.
Okay. Thank you. So first of all, I think there is it's very difficult because whilst we can put out these messages, it's about the actual consumers implementing them. So being able to provide those tools and so forth is important. But if you and therefore having a basic level of taking those preventative steps, if you like. So we know from the health perspective, with COVID, there's basic health hygiene, there's basic hygiene. In the cyber world, there's basic cyber hygiene. And so it's taking those reasonable steps in terms of a scam that I think that even with basic messaging, maybe they should, people should be taking that on board and owning it as a responsibility of theirs. But also, and taking it from what Mike Haley was saying this morning about, one of his partner's colleagues being fired from work because they got involved. They posted £50,000 to a scammer. There has to be a responsibility on the businesses and others to actually recognise this is a major problem. We need to be educating. We need to be demonstrating from the top down as well that this is important. It's about protecting, and there's nothing wrong with putting your hand up and saying, well, actually, can I just check this with you? Having those policies in place and explaining why that's important as well. So I think there is responsibility across the board, but there's also there's a responsibility on us as well.
Okay, fantastic. And how about you, Kit?
Sure. Is it unfair to say everyone? I'm not sure if that's unfair. I feel like from anyone's perspective, whether it's a financial institution or a school or the government, I feel like it's just such a underplayed threat. I know among us we realize it's a threat, but something I was thinking about recently is that even if we have solutions, like I know there's many of us here that have different software solutions or AI or whatever it ends up being, if the average person on the street has no idea that, one, the solution exists, or two, that it's a threat, like what good is the solution if you don't even know it's a problem? So yeah, I would just say everyone. From a U.S. perspective, I would love to see, I don't know how much it is going on over here, but more like funding or support from our government saying like, yeah, we'll help anyone who can to produce this stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think everyone has a responsibility. I think one of the key things is to have partnerships at a local level that bring together all the different groups, relevant NGOs, obviously in the UK we have bodies like Age Concern, but obviously the council that deals with community safety, the police, so the banks, they all have a role. And there's probably some niche areas where we need kind of to be more special. I recently did a study of the over 75s, and we asked them who should, provide them with support and education on scams, and the overwhelming response back was friends and family. So kind of, the children of the older adults need to kind of work with them to kind of help them. And I think that's quite key. And obviously, there's going to be some older adults who don't, disconnected. And I think that's where the challenge comes. Those are the really lonely ones, probably the most vulnerable also to scams. But I think it should be a community response, working together.
And I think on responsibility, it's really important. In the past, it has often seemed like it's always been on the consumer or the individual or the potential victim. I think it's really important that we emphasise that it is a shared responsibility. And I think increasingly we're seeing governments step up and say that, and we're seeing industry step up and say that. But I do think we need to be careful about putting too much of that focus on the individual in a world where we all know it's getting more and more technologically complex and harder to detect what is a scam. Even if you're as a highly educated fraud person, you could still be scammed.
I think you all bring up really great points. Again, sorry for my voice. I've been speaking quite a bit today, but I will tell you I have a wish and maybe one or all of you will take me up on this, if you did an analysis of every bank, social media company, advertising platform, you name it, use some criteria and then evaluate how they are doing in terms of fulfilling their responsibility to educating their users. I would be very fascinated to read that report. So hint, hint, if any one of you want to take that up, we would all love to see that. Okay, great. So I think that, again, let's assume then that we've created messaging that's ideal, that everybody, in fact, is doing their part to do this education. What does successful prevention education look like? What would you measure? What does it look like to you?
Look, happy to have a go at this one. I think really there's a number of ways you can measure. I mean, ideally what you want to see is behaviour change. I think if you have access to funding and good research, you need to also use that to evaluate campaigns and to look at whether there has been actual behaviour change. But I think the other thing, and often one that can scare organisations, is really, if you're focusing on educating people and they are actually getting better at identifying scams, you should see an increase in engagement with your organisation about scams, possibly even in reporting of scams. Looking at and using data to really evaluate whether the messages are getting through, I think, is really, really important. But yeah, we really want to see that behaviour change. You want to see more people being able to, examples of them being able to avoid scams. You want to see them engaging more in, say, the tools and resources that are being put out there. I think we've heard about that. You know, wherever they're engaging, you want to see that it's not something that's not talked about anymore.
Great, yes. Jill?
Yep, certainly. So it's about the consumers taking that reasonable, those reasonable precautions, and also always looking out for new ways to be safer, but whilst at the same time not forgetting those basics either. Maybe increasing in reporting suspected scams, as you were saying earlier today, just by texting 7726. There's everything that's going on in the back end is then helping prevent similar scams taking place to those who maybe aren't so educated or familiar with it. So never assuming that it's a job done. It's always a consistent journey, because the threats are always just changing and being tweaked all the time. So constantly looking out for that.
Yeah,
Great,
I think one thing that comes to mind from my perspective is maybe we would expect to see a general sentiment change among people, like folks who come into my live streams or comment on the videos. There's this, a lot of times I actually filter out these comments because it makes me so frustrated, but people will just say, you would have to be stupid to fall for this. That's like a very common, I think, misconception. So I would expect to see, if we're doing our jobs correctly, that like that general sentiment would go away. Another one is, I think a lot of the victims that I talk to are like afraid to re-engage with the internet or their computer. Like once they've been, if violated is the right word, they're now afraid to do online banking or even log into their computer at this point. So perhaps we would also see a shift in people's confidence in technology and online.
Their cyber resilience.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'd echo the rest of the panel's views. The key indicator of success is declining victimization. It's got to be, generally in society, and if we're looking at, a specific context, particular type of fraud, declining that level of fraud, that's got to be the measure of success. But I think some other proxies could be things like reporting more and stuff like that, but it's got to be down to levels of victimization, otherwise it's not succeeding.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that, there are things that can be done today. A lot of what you're saying does not feel insurmountable. We're just not doing it. So if you could advise your peers here in this room today, and anybody that might be listening to the recording after, what is one thing any of us could do today or tomorrow, leaving this conference, to move forward what we've just discussed?
Oh, go ahead.
You go. No, you go first.
We've been going. Sure, we'll switch it up. What comes to mind to me is like creativity and like trying things that are outside of the box. I see so much of the scammers are constantly coming up with a new thing every day. There's a flavor of the week. New scams are submitted to me every day to investigate, and so like, why aren't we coming up with new things? The other in general is, I don't know how many of you, if I dare say, like have a budget specifically set aside for like scam prevention and scam awareness. I don't know if that's a line item on the average company's budget list.
So you want money?
Not for me. I think people need to take it seriously, though. Yeah.
Got it. Yes.
I'd probably say explore collaboration. I know that's something with the National Anti-Scam Centre we've been set up to do, and working with a range of stakeholders and deliver campaign and education in conjunction with others. It can be more impactful. You can leverage, existing really good channels to get messages out that might be in a way that's not costly. And I really do think about the language you're using around scams if you want to remove the shame as well. And so, just think carefully about how we talk about it. And we've heard a lot about that today, but these are crimes and they're perpetrated against people no different from other really serious crimes.
Yes, totally agree. Yes. And
I think one thing that we can do is share best practice and knowledge. And obviously I mentioned some of the studies that I'm aware of, and I've done a pretty extensive search, but what we need is a repository of different things that have been tried and evaluated, and we share that so we can all learn from each other's failures and successes. And maybe this is something Gaza could do, is to kind of create that kind of repository. It's the kind of thing I think it would be very good to do. So I think that for me is the key thing. Obviously money also comes into that, because they need to be evaluated, and we're here to help if you need, and there are some other universities here. So, but yeah, that's the key thing.
fantastic. And Jill, I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
comment.
no, certainly. And I think from the scam prevention and the money is what we found from the cyber perspective as well. It's very difficult to be able to justify spend in a preventative way, because how much do you save for it? It's cost avoidance. And so often, as we've seen there, is people and businesses and others will think about it after the event, and then you can see how much it's actually cost versus what the solution could be, and what the spending less money up front to prevent the impact later on. So from that perspective, it's sort of talking, sharing and reporting. It's incredible through a number of sessions today what is going on in the collaboration space on those platforms that is going on in the background. I think that's brilliant. And just sort of accept nothing, believe no one, and check everything.
Right. But I do want to leave everyone, as we close out this panel, that it can feel dystopian. It can feel discouraging when you hear the numbers, when you see the losses mounting, when you hear victim stories. But I think what you've given us all is something to think about, and I need to take some of what you've said back, including money, and think about how Trend Micro will help to make that happen. And I agree that for those of you who are part of Gaza, this is something Gaza could absolutely help facilitate, is to start to promote those education initiatives and content that's working. And you have data that is showing that that's working. I think that's an ask we can make today of Gaza. So with that, I do want to turn the audience to, we have a few minutes for questions with this panel, and then we'll turn it to the next panel. There is a microphone floating around, so if you have a question, Fiona, we have somebody here.
Right. Thank you. Andrew Campling, I run a consultancy. To sound a rather pessimistic note, whilst I don't have a problem with the idea of, yes, of course, we should do education, and it might stop some of the more stupid attacks and scams, the obvious amateur ones. But I think we need to be realistic. We're competing with international organised crime, state-sanctioned threat actors, and so on, who are targeting my mum and dad. it's an asymmetric battle. And also the tech sector is largely dismantling a lot of the defences that we can use to defend against those attacks. So it's a comment, I suppose, as much as a question. It feels to me like, whilst we should do education, I think we shouldn't fool ourselves that it's going to make more than a very tiny difference. Yes, it's important, but it's way insufficient, given who we're up against. And I don't know if you think that's too pessimistic or if you'd agree.
I have thoughts, but if anyone...
Yeah, you go first. Yeah.
I think, Lynette, I think you had potentially floated the idea of talking about the word scam in general, and that immediately comes to mind to me is like, I just sometimes think the word scam doesn't really cover it anymore, because you're absolutely right that these are like sophisticated, targeted, like I see these attacks that are planned out. They're targeting your family. They clone your grandson's voice and they call, like that's not, to me, that's not a scam. That's not like an average thing that we see every day. So I don't know if that relates at all to what you're saying, but I wonder if part of the education in general is like, we have to get away from this mindset that the scam is something that you made a mistake and you fell for, and it's this lighthearted, no one would fall for. These are serious financial crimes. So perhaps that's part of the education, is that this is a really big deal. I don't know if we can change the word. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it would be great if we could. But, there's research that shows that it also resonates in terms of people being able to understand what sorts of things that might relate to. So I think it's a hard one in terms of the language, whereas some of the cybersecurity can be really, language can be really overwhelming for people as well. But I think on the point about pessimism, I think when you think about education, we can distill it down to thinking it's just about telling people what they need to do to prevent themselves, and I'm going to say being scammed, not the words that I would encourage people to use, but that's how it can be perceived. I think really what education needs to think about more is much broader than that. We need to make sure that people who are victims of crimes, these types of crimes, know where to go, know how to get help, know what to expect from the businesses and industries that they are engaging with. It's more than just they need to know what actions they need to take to avoid something. And the other part of it is that I think we all need to do better, is that people broadly want to really feel that there is work being done to stop these criminals and to combat scams. And some of the research shows that I know in Australia that communities and people do not know what's going on. They might report things, but they don't know, what do you do with this information? You talk about collaboration. What does that mean? How does it help? I think we all need to do better about that part of education, about telling them, what does law enforcement do? What does industry and public-private collaboration mean, and how does that help? And why is it important to report the conduct that they see? So I think in a narrow view, yes, we could all feel pessimistic. It's not going to fix the problem. But when I think about education, I'm not just thinking about teaching people how to, avoid a scam, which in itself is a really problematic phrase. I think about it more broadly, and I think there is a big role for it, but it needs to involve some other things that can be equally powerful and help us do the job that we all want to do to help combat crime.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's not about preaching, if you like, it's about giving them the tools and the capabilities to implement those recommendations. So one of the things from Global Cyber Alliance's perspective is it's about providing free tools and resources that will enable people to implement in a straightforward way. That's never going to cover everything, obviously, but what we see there is, and reports back in terms of ransomware, for example, if we apply this in the scam world as well, albeit slightly different, the majority, a significant volume of ransomware attacks have the initial attack vector is through one of those, through basic vulnerabilities or other techniques that could potentially be mitigated before it happens, but it's difficult. I appreciate it's difficult. So,
thank you. It's very good to provoke that thought, though. I know it can feel like, is this all worth it? Is this futile in the end? But I think what I'm passionately hearing from the panel here is that the answer is no, and there's still more we can do. We'll take one more question, and then the panelists will still be here for the remainder of the workshop. And again, there's drinks afterwards, so you can come find them if you have questions as well. Yes. So,
Oh.
okay.
Okay. Yeah, Mathieu Verschuij from Media Vista Flanders. Just a reaction to the pessimistic kind of thing. Education can also be very general education, like you have time, don't react too fast. It's a mindset we have to create with people, because there has been done some research in Flanders about most of the people say a lot of those digital platforms are being forced to being used by us. Platforms of the government, online banking and things like that. They can't be experts in everything. We don't have to teach them how to find errors in phishing mails, how to check URLs and it's becoming more and more difficult. So why don't we just teach them to buy time to ask their network, their sons, their daughters, their family, their friends to help them out? So I think education is not only saying what's going on in the online world, it's just a common mindset of buying time and not
Totally
knowing
agree.
everything.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to Kit's point of, maybe it's time we have the talk, but it's actually this talk, right? So that we are having those conversations with family, friends, and those that we would lean on if we ever did get into trouble. Because those conversations, as I showed, are not happening today. I really want to thank our illustrious panel. There were many hands up, and so I'm sure they'll be seeking you out for the remainder of today and tomorrow. So if we could give a big round of applause.